So throughout the years, I have been watching many students that often come with more or less some music knowledge, but they don't really know what the instruments are. So I want to make more or less some kind of big map all around where I can just show you what kind of sounds and how you can group the idea of using instruments. We're going to talk about what instruments usually conform music and one way of organizing them so you find faster the type of instrument that you might want to use for whatever you might want to do. I will also do specific videos on the different groups of different instruments, so don't worry about it. This is more or less like a big map. It doesn't matter if you're just a beginner, if you're more or less an intermediate. I think it's helpful because we are fortunate enough to have a lot of decent samplers online and just start our computer and start playing any instrument. But a fresh reminder is never bad for our ears. So straight from Mexico City, my name is Juanchis, and let's talk about what kind of instruments can we usually use in a music production. Don't pay attention that I'm on Ableton Live. I know this is mostly a Reaper channel. Making MIDI instruments play is much faster for me on Ableton Live. In the most basic definition of music, we usually have this thing about rhythm, harmony, and melody playing along together, right? So let's start with the most basic thing, rhythm. So this is a drum kit. It sounds silly, but I'm sure, because I've been teaching long enough, that not everyone has seen a drum kit. So the most basic version of a drum kit is usually just having a kick drum, this big rounded wood percussion down here. The snare, that's the round here looking upwards, usually closer to the drummer. And the hi-hat, that's usually on the left of the drummer, right? I like this version of how to express it, and I will link it in the description. 8-Bit Music Theory made a beautiful video that I've been using for years now to try and explain to first newcomers how to build a rhythm, how to build the rhythm section, even just with 3 elements like a drum on the drums with kick, snare, and hi-hat. So the kick is this really lower punch that usually doesn't have a note to it, but if it lasts for long as it could last, you usually will end up with some sort of note that could create some sort of harmony problem if you're not careful while tuning your drums. Lucky for us, we have very decent virtual instruments, and we can even tune those and make them sound however we want. So I can change the tuning of my kick drum digitally so much faster than I can do it physically. Also, for recording drums, it's harder. You need a more or less nice space. You need to know about mic placement a little bit. You can explore all you want, but eventually, if you want this kind of drum sound, you need to be able to work well yourself within a room. So usually, the kick drum is this pulse, this steady rhythm of where we are heading. And then the snare usually gives us that extra information of how we are getting there and this space between that rhythm that's going on. And the hi-hat usually gives a nice information and a nice play against the snare where they're feeling I say they because it's 2 cymbals placed one against each other and played with the left foot and the right hand. And they're playing along, giving a certain rhythm and a certain interpolation of accents and silences. And that's the most basic drum sound that you might want. You can go as basic as you want and you can go as complex as you want, but the drum kit consists of actually more things. So you have these 2 wooden thingies above that are called toms, and there's usually one on the right of the drummer that we cannot see in this photo. That's called the floor tom. It's usually longer than the kick drum, but it's usually smaller in its circumference. They actually have a very clear tone to them, usually. So since they have so much tonal information, I think, for me, it's really important that they actually fit the harmony of your song. Eventually, if you're doing modulations and whatnot, doesn't matter as much, but that also depends on the drummer, if how many toms they are using and how they fit those, because those are part of the melodic language of the drum, even though it's just percussion, it's just the rhythm section. Up here, we usually have 2 things, the crash and the ride. The ride usually goes on the right of the drummer and the crash goes on the left. Crash is the one that you usually use for transitions. So you will listen to the crash on your right next to the hi-hat, and the ride is on the other side. Usually the ride has a lot more sustain to it, because when drummers usually try to make two sections different in the form way of thinking across the arrangement, they usually change from their hi-hat towards the ride, so it has another intensity, another kind of energy, and another texture to it, instead of just having this. Instead of just having these two sounds, and they have more articulations on their hi-hat, but it's nice to have a longer sustained sound whenever you're trying to do another kind of things. That's a drummer way of thinking. So yes, we usually have this very basic drum acoustic kit that has varied across time with time, sizes, woods, and tunings, and types of cymbals, and everything that you can do around them, right? But eventually, what happened is that between this whole idea of the machines taking over our jobs and what we do, the electric machines and the drum machines came along with the lean drum, the C78, the 909, 606, 707, 808, and so on. They sound more or less like this. And that's a sound that you're really familiar with. That kind of drums took away this kind of actual expression of a person playing and interacting with other instruments, but it opened up a whole other way of dealing with the rhythm section. It allowed a lot more sound design to it, because when you're recording drums, you need a good room with good microphones. And if you only have a digital sample that you can handle and manipulate, then you can twist the length, you can distort it. You are less bound to other problems. You have to welcome the new ones, but you are less committed to your room and your microphones, because you're doing some sort of physical handling if you have a physical drum machine, or you are doing some digital handling with it. And I still believe that as long as you're actually developing your craft, there's really a hard way for us to get replaced by machines. Like, it doesn't make sense. If you're like just dragging loops into your session, you're so easy to be replaced. Try to develop your craft if you want to be in this for the long run. Eventually, the music technology evolves so much that we end up with plugins like this, where we have so many versions of what we can do with physical manipulation and digital manipulation, where maybe there's a kick drum recorded and then it's handled in some way and then it's resampled and placed into something like this, or something like this, or something like this, and everything in between and everything out of this between. So drums, or the rhythm section, can sound in so many different ways. And if you're using only the analog way of doing it, I invite you to try and explore how samples can boost and enhance your sound. And if you're using only digital sounds, it might be interesting to train your ear to know what ambience actually sounds like, because microphones do bring a certain depth to music that's sometimes being lost in music production when it's all sample-based. Just as toms are this only melodic part of the drums, we have this whole other category of minor percussions, or percussions that are a lot more melodic. And all of these melodic percussions are, most of them come from the orchestral world, like xylophones and glockenspiels and kalimbas and marimbas and whatnot. They also have these tubular bells, where they usually have these long tubes hanging from something that are made out of metal. But the idea of this, it has a really clear short sound, but it has a clear sustain and a clear note to it, and it usually sounds something like this. You could look into so many sounds like this. I don't know, like something like that. So the whole idea of these melodic percussions is that you have claves, you have bongos, that since they usually come in only two, the most common thing is that they have an intervallic relationship to them. And that's why percussionists need to have so many congas and so many bongos because they match their sounds and they have a limit on their tuning for them to perform well. So sometimes a digital version of this might sound better if you want this big chromatic register to them. But even something like claves or the cowbell, the so famous cowbell from More Cowbell Please. The whole idea is that that has to be in tune with whatever you're playing. Like it has to fit the harmony itself, right? So there's this small world where the percussion is only like this digital drum percussion, and then you have the electronic drums, and then you have this thing that mutates into the melodic side of it, where they are actually making something singable in some cases. And you have these kind of percussions that are not singable, but they actually help so much to the rhythm. There's like so many percussions in the world that there's no way of making one single video that covers every single one of them. Especially in Latin America, we have so many percussions, so it's hard to talk about it. We have cabazas, we have cuicas, and there's so many, so many, so many. So let's move on. I think it's right to go into the domain of the bass. Well, yes, first the bass was an acoustic bass played with the fingers. In English, I think it's the upright bass. I hope I'm saying it correctly. And eventually, technology hits and we electrify the instrument and we get the electric bass. Both of them can show up in genres like jazz and so on, but probably the electric version of it hasn't been explored as much because usually it's being only left to play the most basic way, that's just like sustaining the band, and there are not too many projects that take advantage of the melodic side of it. Even though you have basses that could be P bass, precision bass, or jazz bass, you have very classic tones like the Hofner, you have different types of strings, and there's like a whole world inside of the bass players. The sound of this one is usually metallic but with enough low end, and if it doesn't have low end, it's quite a nasal instrument. And usually the sound of bass, unless it's really low, it's quite nasally. It depends on the style again. Many of these things really, really depend on the style. But sometimes most of the sound of the bass can be heard through the metallic side of it. That's around 700 to 1.5. Something like that. Like I know I have my bass right there, but like this is just a plugin and it helps me demonstrate the example really fast. The whole idea with bass is it helps push a lot the rhythm, but probably one of the instruments that has to learn more about when not to play is the bass, because it can give a lot of rhythm and it can really drive the rhythm section, and it can also give so much space for other melodies to fit in. So I love the bass. Like it's a really interesting instrument. Eventually, not only is it electrified, but it evolves into a whole other way of being played. Eventually, the synthesizers come along, and in this case, this is a one single voice, a monophonic instrument, a monophonic synthesizer that can only play one note, and it has been used as a melodic instrument up higher in the octaves or as a low instrument bass. and it has like this really growling low end, and you have so many parameters to mess around with articulation. There's a nice fact that I think it's interesting. The patches, or some of the patches that were made in synthesizers that were meant to sound as organs, someone someday said, what if I play it low enough and I set it as a monophonic instrument and it sounded like this? And that gave birth to the whole bass sound in house music and a lot of electronic genres that actually use organ patches as bass sounds. So one of the fun things that I think you can do when playing with synthesizers is just playing another octave. Maybe that works for that style, but you're in the wrong octave because the articulation gives you that option. So synthesizers really have their own universe, and they went into this bass sounding, but eventually they also mutated and transformed the whole key instrument world. So even though we had pianos that have been around for a couple of hundred years now, they have this difficulty to themselves, that you need a piano that's properly tuned, because since they are based on a key that hits a hammer that hits a string, well, that moves a hammer that hits a string, if the string is not with the right tension, it's not tuned. So it's hard to move big pianos, or it's hard to move even upright pianos just against the wall, because they might suffer some detuning so easily. So these kind of instruments that have this very classical sound to them, eventually the music production industry started exploring them, distorting them, and playing around with them. But eventually it got electrified, and we ran into this sort of electronic or electric keyboard that's not a piano anymore. And for it to make sound, you had to amplify it, and most of the times you ended up using some sort of guitar amplifier and something like the so named Rhodes, that so many people often think that there's only the Rhodes, but there's also the Wurlitzer, and there were so many models around them. They sound like this. And they sound so nice, but they have their own way of expressing, because these open up the world for us to connect keys into guitar pedals through a straight speaker out, or a guitar amp, or a bass amp. And the whole electrifying of music is fascinating for me. So we have the electric keyboards that usually with the pianos have some of the responsibility of the big harmonic picture, along with the guitars, because they can play so many things at once, and they can use the notes in such a way that they do give a lot of interesting places for harmony, right? Eventually, this became synthesized. And with that came stuff like this that you have probably seen. But one of the beautiful things is that so many people also say stuff like, that's an analog synth. That's why it sounds so unique, because it's analog. Well, unlucky for you, many analog synths have digital sources. So it's not just because it's analog. There's a certain magic to designing your own sound across time, and to have a certain timbre evolution that fits the arrangement. And these things were so magic that you could even build stuff that sounded like one group of instruments, but also sounded like others. This is some sort of keyboard that goes into a string sound. And we have some epic sounds on this. That even sounds like a cat in that register. So synthesizers revolutionized everything in so many ways. It's really interesting how music has evolved so much across years. And we have so many types of synthesis now. There's not only one way of making sound. I also have a couple of videos on how to use synthesizers if you want to check them out. Within the synth world, I think it's important to have clarity that if you only say that's a synth, that's probably not enough information for you to make a sound that you're trying to make. Because you have stabs, you have pads, you have swells, bass, you have brass, you have sequencers, arpeggiators, and so many things. So I will also make a video on that. But yeah, we can probably get over the idea of just saying that's a synth. And of course, if you want to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, it's much appreciated. So from keys, we actually go into the guitar world. And the guitar world, it's a world on its own. You have so many things that went from just the acoustic guitar, where it was just wood and strings again. And then it got electrified. And that gave birth to blues and to jazz and rock. And that gave birth to metal. And that revolutionized, again, the music industry in so many ways. You have so many gadgets that attach themselves to the sound of guitar players, like pedals, amplifiers, ways of processing the guitar before you actually hit the amp, and so many sound design around the guitar tones. That's a whole universe on its own. I will play a couple of examples right here, and the sound has evolved so much. And it's such a big world that I'd rather not get too much into it because honestly, I don't know enough about guitars. So let's start talking a little bit about brass section. You have these metal melodic instruments that when you group them all together, you have this extra layer of harmony. There are so many libraries that actually sound good. This is one of the libraries that I really like how it sounds because it gives me that actual limit of what would a brass player actually do. As you can hear, it doesn't let me play for as long as I want. Eventually, it just cuts because that's the breath of the player actually making that sound. So it doesn't make sense to just give you an infinite amount of air because that's one of the things that fails the most when you're actually trying to make programming of real brass. That's one of the things that fails the most. Yeah. I think this one sounds really, really good. You have so many articulations. You can switch from one to another. I have trumpets, I have saxophones, I have trombones. And the whole idea of brass in my head is that it's a section or a group of instruments that you can think of as something that answers the actual melody or the developing melody within the track, the song, or whatever you want to call it. And it can also add an extra layer of harmony. And that's why they were usually used only for tension. We could keep talking on and on about all of the sections within an orchestra that all fit within the music production. But essentially, we could just group this string section. And the string is usually an instrument that can give you plenty of articulations, like that long sustained sound, or something like this. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it because sometimes some instruments are actually just separated by their duration and what are they bringing to the music that you're playing. It's string in the sense that it has a certain texture to it and you can sustain it for as long as you want. You can keep on sustaining and playing against the string and giving a certain tension, or you can pinch it, and that's the pizzicato. You can pinch it and pull it, and that gives another sound to it. There's so much to learn how to listen about music because I feel that sometimes when people just go into music production, they just want to make music and they don't even know what tools they have at hand. And I'm not talking about compressors, trust me. I'm talking about the most basic way of understanding instrumentation and how you can use that to make musical thing that gives you a certain feeling and why sometimes you're lacking rhythm, or you're lacking melody, or you're lacking of this emotional content that's given by the harmony. So yes, in that sense, you could sum up music as rhythm, harmony, and melody. In that sense, I will keep on making these kind of videos that try and invite you, help you explore what actually music making is in so many levels. So if you like these kind of videos, be sure to comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please leave any comments if you have any kind of questions or you want any kind of videos for me to line them up and straight from Mexico City. My name is Juanchis, and thanks for listening.